Hi, I'm Rachel. Last night, over lobster and wine, my sister stood up in a crowded restaurant and said, "Go find another table. This one's for family, not adopted girls." They all laughed, even my mother. Then the bill came, 3,270 euros, the whole meal, their meal. And they left it for me. I paid it, quietly. But just as I stood to walk away, a voice said behind me, "Just a moment, please." You think you know where this is going, but you don't, because sometimes walking away isn't weakness, it's the beginning of war. I had told myself all day to stay calm, but my hands still tightened on the steering wheel as I pulled into the valet line outside the restaurant. Chicago's cold air pushed through the crack in my window, carrying the smell of rain and exhaust. The building's glass doors reflected back my own face, brushed hair, and a soft navy coat. I had chosen to look more like the women in my sister's circle. Inside, the lobby glimmered with chandeliers and the hum of expensive laughter. For a moment, it felt like stepping onto a stage where everyone else had rehearsed their lines, and I was the one still fumbling. I told myself, "Breathe, Odessa, just breathe." This was only dinner. Only family. The hostess guided me past polished tables and couples speaking in low, private tones. The silverware gleamed under candlelight. I spotted them near the back, a long table draped in white linen, filled with familiar faces but turned slightly away from me. My sister Venetia saw me first. Her lipstick matched the wine in her glass. She stood, her smile broad and bright, like she was welcoming a guest of honor. But there was an edge, sharp enough to feel across the room. "Rachel," she called out, using the name I hadn't gone by in years. "Go find another table. This one's for family, not adopted girls." Her voice carried farther than she probably expected. Heads from neighboring tables turned. A little ripple of laughter broke out among our relatives, some nervous, some not. My stomach went hollow. My feet felt fixed to the floor, but I didn't let my face fall. I forced a small, polite curve of my lips. "It's Odessa," I said softly, but no one answered. The waiter, caught in the crossfire, brought over a small chair and set it at the edge of the table, slightly apart like a spare part that didn't fit. I lowered myself onto it. My palms rested flat on my lap to stop them from trembling. That's when I noticed the napkins. Everyone else's folded white with silver rings, mine a bright red square tossed across the plate. "Red suits her," Venetia said, tilting her head. "Makes her stand out." There were a few chuckles. My mother adjusted her bracelet and said nothing. My father reached for the bread basket, his eyes on the butter knife. Dinner stretched on in slow motion. I picked at my salad, listening to the clatter of forks and the careful, pointed remarks about my job, my apartment, how grateful I must be for all they'd done. Venetia told a story about a charity gala she'd hosted, glancing at me like she was making sure I heard each detail. I nodded at the right times, sipped my water, and tried to swallow past the lump in my throat. When dessert plates were cleared, I saw the waiter heading back, a folded check in his hand. He stopped at my chair and set it down in front of me without a word. The number at the bottom blurred before my eyes. $3,270. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Venetia leaned forward, her voice just loud enough for the entire table. "Well, she should pay. She owes us everything." Heat rose up my neck, but I kept my eyes on the paper. The years of small humiliations, whispered jokes, being treated like an outsider despite every holiday, every sacrifice, they all crowded in at once. I took a slow breath. My fingers curled around the stem of the wine glass I hadn't touched all night. I lifted it, took a sip, and felt the cool liquid steady my heartbeat. "No problem," I said, sliding my card across the table to the waiter. My voice didn't shake. My hands did, but I folded them in my lap again. The waiter nodded and walked away. Venetia's laugh rang out. Someone clinked a glass. My father coughed into his napkin. The whole table seemed to loosen now that the bill was handled. I sat back slightly, the red napkin glaring up at me from my plate like a warning flag. And then, just as Venetia reached for her phone to take a picture of the table, just as someone raised a toast to her boldness, a voice behind me cut through the noise. "Just a moment, please." I turned toward the voice, heart still steadying from the weight of that dinner bill and the laughter it brought. Behind me stood a woman I didn't recognize, maybe in her 60s, dressed in a crisp, cream-colored blazer with a single gold pin on the lapel. Her hair was pinned back in soft curls, her presence calm but quietly commanding. She rested a hand on my shoulder, just lightly enough not to startle, and repeated with grace, "Just a moment, please." The table hushed again. Forks froze mid-air. "Excuse me?" Venetia raised an eyebrow. "Do we know you?" The woman didn't answer her. Instead, she turned to the waiter, who still stood awkwardly nearby, holding my card. "May I take a look at that?" she asked, nodding toward the check. Her tone was polite but firm, the kind that left no room for refusal. The waiter hesitated, then handed it over. She scanned the receipt with a speed that suggested she wasn't new to this sort of thing. "This is the total for the entire party?" she asked, though the question clearly wasn't for me. "Yes, ma'am," the waiter replied. "They asked for one check." The woman glanced up, her eyes slicing through the awkward silence. "And it was placed in front of this young woman, despite the fact that she ordered the least." I felt the entire table shrink, though no one moved. Venetia scoffed. "Why are you involved in this? This is a private dinner." The woman finally gave her a full look. "Then perhaps you should have kept your insults under your breath." A few relatives chuckled nervously, unsure of which side they were supposed to be on. "Listen," Venetia said, waving a hand. "This has nothing to do with you. This is family business." "Funny," the woman replied. "I've watched families eat together for decades in this city. Never once have I seen one publicly humiliate a guest, let alone their own." That last word, own, landed hard. An uncle at the far end of the table muttered, "She should be grateful we let her sit with us at all." It was like a slap I saw coming but still couldn't dodge. I kept still, eyes locked on the glass in front of me. I felt heat bloom across my chest, but I didn't speak. Not yet. Marlene, the woman, I would later learn her name, set the check back on the table gently, like she didn't want to dirty her fingers with it. "Kindness costs less than this meal," she said, then turned to me. "You have more grace in silence than they do in speeches." Then she smiled, not at the family, but just at me, and walked back to her table like she hadn't just cracked the entire room wide open. Nobody said a word for a full 15 seconds. Then Venetia leaned back, smirking like none of it mattered. "Some people really like to insert themselves," she said, loud enough for everyone. The chatter resumed, forced and brittle. Someone mentioned a weekend trip to Lake Geneva. My mother stirred her coffee with exaggerated focus. My father asked the waiter for another glass of red, and I sat there, pulse high in my ears, staring at the red napkin on my plate. It wasn't just a napkin. It was the way every moment tonight had been scripted, just for me to be the one left out again. And suddenly, I remembered. I was 14 at a family barbecue in my uncle's backyard. I had brought a tray of deviled eggs I made myself. No one touched them. They served everyone else first. I sat on a cooler with a paper plate of burnt hot dogs, watching the camera flash as they posed for a group photo. I wasn't asked to join. Later, my aunt told me they didn't want to make it awkward. That same line echoed now in my mind. Didn't want to make it awkward, so they made it painful. I reached for the red napkin, folded it slowly, deliberately, into a neat square and set it gently beside my empty plate. Then I looked straight at Venetia. Really looked. She noticed. Her grin wavered. She leaned slightly forward. "Something to say?" she asked, voice low. I didn't reply. Silence can speak more than shouting ever could. I think that's what rattled her. The weight of that moment, the stillness of it, was louder than her mockery. She reached for her wine, paused halfway, and leaned in again. This time her tone wasn't playful. "This is only the beginning," she whispered, her eyes sharp, mouth tight. "You don't belong, and you never will." I didn't flinch. Not when she whispered it. Not when her words sat there between us like smoke from a match just lit. I stayed still. The chatter around us grew louder again, clinking silverware, forced laughter, a waiter dropping a spoon, but inside the quiet thundered. It was the kind of silence that presses into your skin, not around you, but within. I breathed in slowly. The scent of seared scallops and buttery garlic filled my nose, but it didn't matter. Everything tasted like metal now. The air had shifted. I could feel my cheeks warm, not from shame this time, but from a different kind of heat, one that had been building for years beneath the surface. I stared at the red napkin, that stupid, deliberate square of fabric still folded by my plate like a dare. I didn't reach for it. I didn't touch my water either. I let the stillness speak. And while Venetia leaned back, smug, assuming she'd won some invisible battle, my mind began to drift. Back to my 16th birthday. It was a rainy Saturday. I'd waited all afternoon, excited despite myself. I knew better than to expect balloons or gifts like Venetia's Sweet 16 Bash, the one with the DJ and catered sushi, but I had still hoped. That night, after the neighbors left, after the leftover hors d'oeuvres were packed away and the speakers unplugged, my mother brought me a single cupcake from the fridge. No candle, no song. "We didn't forget," she said, setting it on a paper towel. "Just thought we'd keep it simple this year." I ate it standing by the sink, while Venetia giggled in the living room, scrolling through pictures she'd just taken with her friends. They hadn't taken one photo of me that day, not one. Back at the table now, that same emptiness rose inside me. But this time, it didn't hollow me out. It sharpened me. I looked across the table at my parents. My mother tapped at the condensation on her glass, her eyes glued to the melting ice. My father checked his watch as if there were anywhere else he'd rather be. They hadn't said a word since the bill came, not one word. The others carried on, biting into creme brulee, smirking at inside jokes I was never part of. Venetia was already regaling them with some story about a work trip to Miami, full of names I'd never heard and places I'd never been invited. And that's when I saw it, the bracelet. It caught the light when Venetia reached for her fork, a thin diamond tennis bracelet with a tiny clasp I knew by touch. I'd saved 2 months for it. Gave it to my mother for her birthday one year, wrapped in pale blue tissue. Now it sat on Venetia's wrist like it had always been hers. I didn't say a word, just like I hadn't said anything the time my old college sweatshirt showed up in a family Christmas photo, on her. Or when my promotion was announced and no one asked how I'd gotten there. They never asked. They just took. Not just things, space, voice, memory. And maybe I had let them. That realization stung more than anything Venetia had whispered. But it didn't break me. I sat taller. Not to make a scene, God knows they'd love that. But to reclaim the air around me. To stop apologizing for breathing it. I reached for my water, took a long, cool sip, set it back down carefully. I didn't rush the movement. I didn't look away. Venetia noticed. Her eyes flicked up to mine, expecting me to wilt or flinch or look away. But I didn't. I held her gaze, and in that moment I felt something shift, not just in me, but in her too. A twitch in her jaw, a blink that lasted too long, a tightening around her mouth. She wasn't as sure anymore. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the way I didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't give her anything to feed off of. But she saw it, something she hadn't expected. I wasn't the girl who sat at the edge of every table anymore. I held her gaze, and for the first time, I felt the balance begin to shift. She blinked, not once, but twice. A flicker. Her confidence, that smooth armor she always wore, cracked for just a second. And I saw it. Venetia tipped her wineglass back and laughed, loudly, unnaturally, like she needed the sound to fill the space where control had just slipped from her fingers. Her laughter bounced off the walls of the restaurant, just a bit too sharp, too forced. The others, predictably, chuckled along, eyes darting between her and me, silently begging the tension to melt back into something easier, safer. It didn't. She tapped her fork against her glass for attention. The sound was high and shrill, cutting through the noise. I could already feel it coming. The next blow. "You know," Venetia began, "Rachel always did owe us. After all, without us, she'd have nothing. Not even a name." There it was. Not a comment, not a jab. A statement, a public pronouncement, declared like fact. Her tone was syrupy sweet, but every syllable dripped with venom. The table went quiet, not out of surprise, but discomfort. Familiar discomfort. Like watching someone drown and deciding not to reach out. An aunt to my left shifted in her chair. My uncle beside her cleared his throat and took a sip of wine, eyes glued to his plate. My mother pursed her lips and looked down. And my father? Well, he just rubbed his temples like he always did when the women started acting up. No one said a word. The waiter, who had returned with fresh water, paused mid-step, sensing the atmosphere. He glanced at me, then turned away quickly. He wasn't paid enough to step into this. I breathed in through my nose, slowly, deliberately. I could have responded. God knows I had words, years of them, neatly folded and stored in the back of my mind, waiting for a moment like this. But I didn't use them. My therapist had once said, "Sometimes silence is your sharpest blade." I never really understood it until that moment. I reached for the red napkin again, still folded from earlier. I smoothed it flat, aligning its edges with precision, as if that act alone could restore order. Then I looked up and met Venetia's eyes. "Be careful, Venetia." That's all I said, soft, calm. A whisper, really. But the table stilled like someone had flipped a switch. She froze, just briefly. Then she laughed again, sharper this time, but her hand trembled slightly as she set her glass down. Marlene hadn't moved from her table, still sitting a few feet away, her posture perfectly upright, a half-finished creme brulee before her. But her eyes were locked on me. She didn't smile, she didn't frown, but she gave the tiniest nod, barely perceptible. I saw it, I felt it. Someone saw me. For once. Venetia wasn't done. Of course not. With a smirk, she reached into her purse, which rested next to her chair, and slid a small velvet box across the table toward me. I didn't touch it. I just stared. She opened it. Inside sat a ring. A family. Heirloom. Our grandmother's. I recognized it instantly. An oval sapphire flanked by two small diamonds. I'd seen it in old photos, on delicate hands long gone. It was supposed to be passed down through generations, by blood. Venetia leaned in, her tone falsely tender. This belonged to Grandma. She always wanted it to go to someone who could carry on her legacy. But let's be honest, Rachel. She paused, letting my name twist in her mouth like it didn't belong there. You could never wear it. It doesn't belong on borrowed blood. There it was again. Not an insult, a disowning, a few chuckles, mostly nervous. My mother looked as if she might say something. Her lips parted, her brow drawn, but then she stopped herself. She always stopped herself. I looked at the ring. It sparkled under the warm restaurant lights, beautiful and cold. but it no longer meant what it once did. The weight of it, the history, the stories, it had all been weaponized. And yet, I didn't feel small. Not anymore. I lifted my gaze back to Venetia, held it. She waited for me to flinch, to cry, to react. But I didn't. I felt nothing but clarity. This wasn't about the ring. It wasn't even about the name. It was about power. And for the first time in my life, I saw clearly that hers was paper thin. The silence stretched. Venetia shifted in her seat. Her smile wavered. She glanced at my father, then my mother, as if silently asking for backup. None came. Marlene took another sip of her coffee, her gaze never leaving me. The moment broke, but not because I moved, because she did. Venetia sat back, crossed her arms, and looked away. For the first time, I wasn't the one shrinking. She was. The room hadn't gotten quieter. If anything, the clinking of glasses and murmurs from other tables filled the space louder than before, but in my world it all went dull. I sat perfectly still. Venetia's laughter had stopped. That smug look she always wore had slipped, just a fraction, but enough that I noticed. For once, she didn't seem so untouchable. Then came the pivot. Someone, Aunt Linda, I think, cleared her throat awkwardly and said something about the weather turning colder. Another relative mumbled something about traffic on Lakeshore Drive. Useless conversation to pad the space, to avoid facing what had just happened. But Venetia wasn't finished. She leaned forward again, the ring box still open in front of me, that garish heirloom gleaming like a trap. Her hand reached out, and with a single flick of her fingers, she pushed it even closer, right beside my water glass. "Maybe she can keep it," she said, not bothering to mask the sneer in her voice. "You know, like a little souvenir. A thank you gift for the bill she just paid." The words came out as a purr, but the message behind them cut like glass. My chest tightened. That ring didn't mean much to me, not in the sentimental way, but it was the way she said it, the implication, that I had bought my seat at this table like a stranger footing someone else's tab. I stared at the ring, then back at her hand. Polished nails, not a tremor. Meanwhile, my fingers trembled around the stem of my glass. I gripped it tighter. I could feel my throat close in, that familiar swell that always came when shame threatened to swallow me whole. 16 again. Back in the kitchen with a 2-sweet cake and 1 flickering candle. Everyone else laughing outside. The past wasn't a memory. It was a shadow stretching across the table right now. And just when I thought she might retreat, Venetia delivered the final twist. She leaned toward me, elbow resting against her wineglass, and spoke low, but not too low. She wanted the others to hear. "You'll never be real family," she said. "Blood tells the truth." It wasn't even about the ring anymore. I think I stopped breathing. No one at the table said a word. My father sipped his wine as though he hadn't heard a thing. My mother blinked, then looked away as if this conversation had become wallpaper she no longer noticed. The betrayal didn't arrive all at once. It came like the tide, soft at first, then rising fast. And just when I thought I might actually break, I felt it. A flicker of something. I looked toward the corner of my eye. Marlene was still seated at her table. Her spoon rested in her saucer, untouched now. She hadn't said a word since her quiet, "just a moment" earlier in the evening. But she hadn't stopped watching either. Her face was unreadable, but steady. She didn't smile, didn't look away. There was no pity in her expression, just something that looked a lot like understanding. Somehow, that mattered. I breathed. My fingers relaxed slightly on the glass. Still, inside me, war raged. Do I get up? Do I finally leave and never come back? Do I give them the last word because it's easier than fighting ghosts in nice clothes? I didn't know. I stared at the ring, That little sapphire sparkled like it had something to say. Across the table, Venetia had begun chatting with an uncle about flights to Palm Springs, her voice light and carefree again, as if the cruelty she just spat wasn't still hanging in the air. I glanced around the table. Not a single person had pushed back. Not one. Even now, the silence around her spoke louder than any insult. I felt the weight of the years pressing down on me. The birthdays missed, the holidays with forgotten invites. The way they still called me Rachel, even after I'd asked, begged, once to be called Odessa, my birth name. The only thing I'd come into this family with, but it had always been easier to rename me than to respect me. Venetia raised her wine glass again, this time with an exaggerated smile. "To Rachel," she announced loudly, "our generous guest." The table erupted in a ripple of laughter, half-hearted clinks of glass, toasts with eyes that wouldn't meet mine. I looked at her. She smirked. I smiled back, barely. A polite, practiced thing. But inside me, something stirred. I almost raised my glass too, until something shifted inside me, something that refused to stay quiet any longer. I let my fingers relax around the stem of the glass. The motion was small, barely noticeable, but deliberate. I didn't drink. I didn't toast. I simply placed the glass back down on the white linen with a soft clink. It wasn't silence out of defeat this time. It was something else. Something I hadn't felt in a long while. Choice. My therapist's words echoed faintly in my head. When you stop asking to belong, you start owning your place. I hadn't understood that before, not really. But now, I did. Belonging had always felt like something dangled in front of me, just out of reach, doled out like a reward. And I'd spent years contorting myself to win it. Tonight, I stopped begging. Venetia was still talking, her voice lifted slightly above the buzz of the restaurant. She gestured toward the centerpiece as if she were hosting the Oscars, her laughter laced with a practiced charm. "This whole thing, my idea of course," she said with a casual wave. "I mean, someone had to make the reservations, coordinate the menu. You're welcome." My eyes stayed on her, unmoving. Every word she said slid under my skin, not because they surprised me, but because I had been the one who did all of it. I'd booked the place 2 months ago. I'd called back and forth about dietary restrictions. I'd paid the deposit. I'd confirmed head counts. And now here she was, claiming it, wrapping herself in the credit like a prize sash. No one questioned her. I didn't correct her, not yet. Instead, I picked up my fork again, not to eat, my plate was already cleared, but to trace the edge of the porcelain, grounding myself. Calm was my weapon tonight, and I intended to wield it well. Then she did it. "She's adopted, you know," Venetia said loudly, turning toward the waiter as he poured fresh water into her glass. "We try to make her feel included. It's kind of like our little family project." Her words were sharp, but the worst part was the delivery, chipper, sugary, as if she were sharing a fun little anecdote over brunch. I felt the sting land before I even processed it. The waiter froze for a breath too long before finishing the pour. A couple at the next table glanced over, pity in the woman's eyes, curiosity in the man's. I stayed still. Heat rushed to my face, but I didn't reach for the glass again. I didn't offer a rebuttal. I knew if I opened my mouth, the pain might come spilling out raw, and I refused to give them that satisfaction. Instead, I placed my fork down gently and folded my red napkin, again, pressed it flat, then laid it across the receipt I'd already signed, the one sitting quietly beside my plate. A neat line, final. Across from me, Venetia was waiting for a reaction. She didn't get one. Her smile faltered for half a beat. Just a flicker, like a glitch in her performance. And then, something unexpected. From the corner of the room, a glass lifted, subtle, almost like a reflex. Marlene, still seated alone, still quiet. She tilted her glass toward me in a soft, dignified gesture, not for attention, not for show. Just for me. I blinked. That quiet nod of solidarity landed with more weight than any speech. It was as if someone had placed a steadying hand on my back and whispered, "Stand up straight." For the first time that night, I allowed myself to believe I wasn't entirely alone. Back at the table, the conversation had shifted. Someone, Uncle Tim, was going on about property taxes and how the city was robbing homeowners. Venetia, clearly bored, leaned in my direction again, dropping her voice just low enough for only me to hear. "Go ahead, Rachel," she said, her tone laced with a mock warmth. "Prove me wrong." I looked at her slowly, my expression unreadable. She didn't realize it yet, but something inside me had already decided, and for the first time, I knew exactly how I would. I didn't flinch, didn't blink. I simply leaned back, folded my arms, and watched her try to keep the upper hand like a dog slipping on ice, fast, loud, and headed nowhere but down. The room had grown quieter, the air sharper. Conversations at surrounding tables slowed, as if some unspoken current told people, something's about to happen here. Venetia, unaware, or maybe too arrogant to care, was still performing. She grabbed the velvet box again, the one with the ring. Grandma's ring, the one she already used to shame me earlier tonight. She slammed it down on the table, hard enough that the silverware rattled. "This," she said, drawing it out like a courtroom exhibit, "this proves who's real family. She doesn't even deserve to touch it." Murmurs floated around us. A few relatives chuckled nervously. My father cleared his throat, but said nothing. My mother kept her eyes glued to the candle in the center of the table like she was hoping it might swallow her whole. I didn't touch the box. I didn't look at the ring. I looked at Venetia. She was breathless now, practically panting from her own fury. And it hit me. She needed this moment more than I did. She needed the audience, the power, the validation. The longer I stayed calm, the more frantic she became. Silence, as it turns out, wasn't just armor, it was a mirror, and she didn't like what she saw in it. She pushed her wineglass aside and leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes narrowed. "You've never belonged here," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "We all know it. You're a charity case wearing nice shoes. You should be thanking us every single day." I watched her lips move, heard every word, but I'd stopped taking in the meaning. My mind had drifted to something else entirely. A drawer back at my apartment. A small sealed envelope, thick with age and dust. It had been handed to me by my grandmother during one of the rare afternoons we'd had alone together. I never opened it, not because I forgot, but because back then I was too scared to believe she might have left me something, anything, just for me. I suddenly wondered if Venetia was afraid of that envelope too. As if on cue, she tossed her head and said, too loudly, it was exhausting cleaning up after Grandma's mess. The finances, the storage unit, all those outdated files. She held on to useless junk like it mattered. I felt the breath catch in my throat. She kept talking. "I handled all of it," she continued, pouring herself more wine with one hand, as if she hadn't just admitted to going through private things. God knows no one else stepped up. The arrogance in her voice was deafening. The ring box still sat between us like a lit match. All I did was tilt my head slightly, the way you might when a stranger says something strange enough to stop a room. Guests from other tables had gone quiet. A few people openly stared now. Venetia was too far gone to notice. Her hands moved with a nervous energy that didn't match her words anymore. For the first time, she looked rattled. For the first time, she looked like the outsider. Then came a whisper. From the seat next to me, Marlene leaned in. Barely an inch, barely a sound. "Hold steady," she said. "The truth doesn't need to shout." I didn't respond, just inhaled slowly. Even the oxygen in this place felt different now, cooler, clearer. Across the table, Venetia squinted at Marlene, then snapped her attention back to me. "She's desperate enough to fake papers," she barked suddenly, slapping her palm on the table. "If she shows you anything, any letter, any will, it's a lie. She's lying." Every fork stopped midair. Someone gasped. I think it was Aunt Cecily. Venetia's cheeks flushed with a blotchy red. Her lips tightened, like she'd just realized she'd said too much. But I didn't say a word. I just smiled. Because she had. Her slip of the tongue was all I needed. Her slip of the tongue was all I needed. She knew it. I saw it in the way her eyes darted across the table, looking for someone, anyone, to reel her back in. But no one moved. They were all still. Even the clatter of silverware had stopped. The restaurant had gone quiet, like the eye of a storm had landed right there, between the linen napkins and empty wine glasses. I reached slowly into my handbag. There was no rush, no need for dramatics. My fingers found the thick envelope at the bottom, yellowed slightly, the seal still unbroken. The handwriting was unmistakable. Grandma's cursive, sharp and clear, with the kind of grace she carried in everything she did. I pulled it out and laid it gently on the table. Venetia flinched. Her eyes went wide for just a breath, then narrowed. "What is that?" she asked, voice tight. I didn't answer. I just opened it, quietly. I unfolded the paper inside, careful not to crease it more than time already had. The document was official, notarized, dated almost 7 years ago. I read it silently first, though I'd read it before in the privacy of my home. This time, I read it for the room, for the truth hanging between every lie they'd let her say. It was Grandma's will, a version that hadn't gone through Venetia's careful hands, the one that never made it into probate, the one she didn't want anyone to see. Without a word, I slid it toward the center of the table. The print was bold and unambiguous. Odessa Rachel, my legal name chosen by Grandma, was entitled to equal inheritance as any other child in the family. No asterisks, no footnotes, no mention of being adopted or included out of kindness. Just listed, named, claimed. Venetia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, drawing attention from every corner of the restaurant. "This is a joke," she snapped. "It's fake. You made this up." Her voice cracked on the last word. She lunged across the table, snatching the document. The paper fluttered but didn't tear. Her hands trembled as she stared down at the name, the date, the notary stamp. "She's lying," she shouted to no one in particular. "She forged this. You all see what she's doing? This is a setup." Gasps, not just from our table, but from others nearby. One older couple at the next booth paused mid-bite, watching with concern. A waiter stood frozen near the kitchen entrance, unsure whether to interrupt or stay back. I didn't move. I didn't respond. I just refolded the document slowly, calmly, and slid it back into the envelope. No rebuttal, no defense. I didn't need one. Venetia was unraveling, and all I had to do was let her. Some of the relatives exchanged glances. I saw Aunt Cecily blink slowly and shake her head. Uncle Jim looked down into his drink, like he was hoping to drown in it. My mother's hand was shaking as she picked up her water glass. And my father, he just stared at the paper, as if he'd never seen me properly before that moment. Maybe he hadn't. Then I placed the envelope down beside my plate, picked up the red napkin, the same one I'd folded earlier with trembling hands, and laid it over the top of the check I'd already covered for everyone. It felt like a quiet ceremony. I didn't say a word, but the gesture was enough. It was the ending of something. Venetia laughed, a brittle, broken sound. "So what? You think that little paper makes you one of us?" Across the room, Marlene stood. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked closer, her heels soft against the tile. Then, with the poise of someone who'd waited a long time to speak, she said, "I was there when Grandma signed that will. I was one of the witnesses. It's real." Her words landed with finality, like a gavel. Venetia's face turned an impossible shade of red. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Marlene didn't look at her. She looked at me. That look said everything. You did it. You held your ground. Venetia stumbled back into her chair, gripping the edge of the table like it might steady her. But nothing would. Not now. Her armor of arrogance had cracked wide open in front of everyone she used to control. I stood slowly, not out of anger, not even pride, just clarity. I placed one hand on the back of my chair and scanned the table one last time. The people who'd raised me in name but rarely in truth. The people who had let someone like Venetia lead with cruelty simply because it was easier than challenging her. My voice was steady. "I don't need your seat at this table anymore." And with that, I turned to leave, knowing nothing in this family would ever be the same again. I didn't look back. The second those restaurant doors pushed open, the night air met me like a quiet celebration, cool, crisp, and honest. It kissed my cheeks and wrapped around my shoulders like the embrace I'd been denied at that table. The heels of my boots clicked softly on the pavement as I stepped away, each step lighter than the last. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of trying to fit into a chair that was never really mine. My chest felt open, unclenched, like I could finally breathe without second-guessing every exhale. I paused at the corner just outside the restaurant, letting the air settle in. From the inside, faint voices still echoed, a chaotic hum behind glass. I didn't have to see it to know what was happening. Venetia was spiraling. She would be clawing for control, lashing out in every direction, accusations, excuses, maybe even tears if she got desperate enough. But none of it could stitch the seams she ripped open herself. Her weapon had misfired. The arrogance that once kept everyone orbiting her now left her exposed in the center of a mess she could no longer manage. And this time, no one would clean it up for her. They were finally speaking up. I could picture it. Aunt Cecily's sharp voice rising, Dad's long silence crumbling into quiet shame. Even the servers likely exchanged glances, questioning what they had just witnessed. The air inside was thick with all the words no one had the courage to say until tonight. She'd dragged them all in, and now they were dragging her down with them. I didn't need to stay and watch it burn. A gentle hand touched my arm. I turned slightly and found Marlene beside me, her coat already on. She didn't say much, just looked at me with that steady calm she always carried. The kind of look that didn't ask questions, didn't need explanations. "You didn't need them to see you tonight," she said softly. "You just needed to see you." My eyes met hers, and I held that moment, grateful for her presence, but even more grateful for the space she was about to give me. She smiled, gave my arm a squeeze, and turned to leave. Her exit was quiet, respectful. She understood this wasn't a moment to fill with more voices. It was one to claim in silence. I stood there a while longer, letting everything wash over me. The wind blew a few strands of hair across my face, and I tucked them behind my ear as I closed my eyes. I thought of Grandma, of her laugh in the kitchen, the scent of lavender on her skin, the way she always said, "You don't earn your place in this world by fighting for scraps. You build it by knowing your worth before anyone else does." She'd seen me before anyone else truly had. She gave me more than a document. She gave me proof, not to them, but to myself, that I had always belonged, that I didn't need their permission to stand tall. I just needed the reminder. And tonight, I got it. my fingers curled around the red, napkins still in my hand. It had somehow made its way out with me, tucked between my palm and purse. Earlier, it felt like a flag of surrender. Now, it felt like something else entirely, a marker of survival, of transformation. It wasn't just a napkin anymore. It was a scar I carried out with pride. I looked down at it, then folded it one last time, tucking it neatly into my coat pocket. Not to forget, but to remember how far I'd come. No tears came. There wasn't any sadness left, only peace. A bittersweet, grounded peace that came from no longer begging for a seat at a table that never served me. A peace that didn't need to prove anything anymore. I whispered, barely audible. Family isn't who you're tied to. It's who stands with you when the world is watching. And I believed it. That sentence used to sting. Now it settled deep in my bones like truth I had finally grown into. Behind me, the restaurant door swung open again, letting out a burst of muffled arguing. I didn't even flinch, just turned my shoulders, faced the quiet night, and stepped forward into it. I didn't know where I was headed next, but I knew one thing for sure. And for the first time in my life, walking away felt like winning.